I was sitting at my sister-in-law Nina's elegant dining table in her beautiful Nashville home. James, my husband, walked over to me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was holding a coffee cup in his hand, just for me. "Don't. You want to try the coffee I made especially for you, honey?" he asked, his voice unusually soft, almost too rehearsed. I looked at the cup in front of me, the one he had placed carefully on the table. Something about it felt off. The smell hit me first, a metallic, almost chemical scent. It made my stomach turn. You know that feeling when something doesn't sit right in your gut, but you can't quite explain why? Yeah, that's what I was feeling. I tried to push it aside. Maybe it was just the kind of coffee James was experimenting with. He'd been getting into different brewing methods lately, but this was different. It wasn't just the smell, it was the way Nina was looking at me from across the table. There was a coldness in her eyes, like she was waiting for something to happen. I didn't want to make a scene. After all, it was just a cup of coffee. But I couldn't shake the unease that had started creeping in. I took a deep breath and forced a smile. "How thoughtful of you," I said, trying to sound casual, as I lifted the cup, pretending to take a sip. But the truth was, my mind was already racing. I couldn't help but think back to the last time I'd been at Nina's house. The tea she'd made, supposedly exactly like hers, had landed me in urgent care. Doctors couldn't explain the symptoms, and Nina had insisted everything was fine, that it was just some bad luck. But I knew better now. I watched as Nina absently stirred her own untouched coffee, still looking at me like she was studying me. There was something in her gaze, something dark behind that smile. "You know, James has really become quite the barista," she said with a smirk. "He's been practicing different brewing methods just for you." The way she said "for you" sent a chill down my spine. It was almost like she was enjoying the moment, like she knew something I didn't. Something I needed to find out. I set the cup down, pretending to be distracted. "I think I'll just step out for a second. Got to make a quick call for work," I said, forcing myself to sound normal. My heart was pounding, but I had to stay composed. Nina gave me a tight smile. "Sure, just don't break anything in there." I nodded quickly and stood up, moving toward the study. But before I went, I made sure to knock over the coffee cup on the table, switching it with Nina's in the confusion. "I'm such a klutz," I laughed, straightening up quickly. I kept my eyes on them as I walked away. My heart was hammering in my chest. I needed to see what would happen when Nina drank that coffee. I had to know the truth. Have you ever had a feeling something wasn't right, but you couldn't put your finger on it? Leave a comment if you've ever been in a situation like this. As I sat back down at the table, pretending to take a sip of the coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced over at James and Nina, and for a split second I saw it. Just a quick exchange of glances between them. Subtle, but enough to make my stomach tighten. It was like they were in on something I wasn't supposed to know. I'd learned to trust my gut over the years, and right now it was screaming at me. But the coffee smelled strange. Something metallic. Something I couldn't quite place. I tried to push it away, forcing myself to drink a little more. But as I looked up at them, I could feel my heartbeat speeding up. It wasn't just the coffee. It was everything. The way James kept glancing at his phone, the way Nina wasn't touching her own coffee, the way they both seemed too calm, too controlled. I tried to push it aside, but then my mind started to wander back to all the little things I had brushed off before, the times I'd felt sick after family meals. But it was always chalked up to something minor. The stomach aches after dinner at their place, a bad meal, maybe something I ate, the time I'd been hospitalized after eating breakfast at their house. James had said it was just a bad reaction to something I ate. The doctors couldn't figure it out, but they all insisted it was a one-off. And Nina, she had a way of smiling at me, like she knew something I didn't. I remembered how I used to feel so welcomed by her. But that feeling faded over time. The little accidents at parties, like when she spilled wine on my dress, or when she accidentally added extra seasoning to my food. The excuses always came. Nothing to worry about, just bad luck. But now, all of those accidents started to feel like something more. I looked back at my coffee cup. I hadn't touched it, but the smell was still there, strong and cloying in my nose. I had to get up. I had to move. Trying to keep my voice steady, I stood up. "I need to make a quick call for work," I said, trying to sound casual. But my heart was racing in my chest. "Sure," Nina replied with a tight smile, her eyes never leaving mine. "Just don't break anything in there." I nodded, forcing myself to look away. But inside, I was already planning. The coffee, the way they were acting. I had to know. I had to find out what was going on, and I wasn't going to get the answers by sitting there, pretending everything was fine. I stepped away from the table, keeping my steps slow. My mind was focused. I didn't hesitate as I moved around the table, pretending to stumble. My hand brushed against Nina's coffee cup, and in the chaos of steadying myself, I quickly switched our cups. It wasn't much, just a small move, but it was enough to set the wheels in motion. I forced a laugh, looking back at them. "I'm such a klutz," I said, straightening up and feeling the knot in my stomach tighten. But my eyes never left Nina's face as I hurried toward the study. As I walked away, my heart was in my throat. I knew this was risky, but I needed to know. The coffee, the looks, the strange things that had been happening. I couldn't ignore it any longer. In the study, I stood quietly by the doorway, watching them. My breath caught in my chest as I saw Nina pick up the coffee. She didn't hesitate. She took a sip. And just like that, the pieces started to fall into place. I stood there, my breath shallow, my heart thudding in my chest as I watched Nina pick up the coffee cup I'd switched. I could feel the seconds stretching into eternity. She took a sip, and then nothing. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe this was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, her face went pale. Her hand started to tremble, and the coffee cup slipped from her fingers, spilling on the table. Nina's eyes widened, and she grabbed her stomach, her breathing shallow. She tried to speak, but it came out as a gasp. That's when I knew. It was happening. I didn't move. I stood frozen in the doorway of the study, trying to keep calm, to hold it together. My mind raced as I processed what I was seeing. The strange smell in the coffee, the sudden change in Nina's expression. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. James looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from confusion to horror. "Nina?" he said, his voice shaky. He stood up, knocking his chair over in the process. "Nina, what's happening?" Nina could barely keep her eyes open, her body shaking violently now. She collapsed against the back of her chair, barely managing to whisper, "James, what did you put in that coffee?" James's eyes flickered to me, then back to Nina. And for a moment, he looked like a deer caught in headlights. He stammered, "That wasn't supposed to be your cup." But his words trailed off, too late to make a difference. I stepped forward, holding my phone tightly in my hand. I kept my voice steady, but my pulse was racing. "I think it's time to call an ambulance," I said, barely above a whisper. My hands were surprisingly calm as I dialed 911. Nina's eyes, wide with panic, locked onto mine. She wasn't the cold, calculating woman I had known. The mask had slipped, and now there was only fear. "You switched. You knew," she said, her voice cracking. "You knew what we were doing." It felt like everything was moving in slow motion. I stood there, on the phone with the dispatcher, all the while hearing Nina's words echo in my mind. "You knew what we were doing?" I didn't let the fear take over, though. I kept my voice steady for the dispatcher. "Yes. We need an ambulance at 1542 Maple Grove Drive," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. "My sister-in-law is having a severe reaction to something in her coffee. She's conscious, but her body is shaking. Please hurry." As I spoke, I could see James backing away from Nina, his face pale and full of dread. He was still denying everything. "Nina, please. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't part of the plan." But his words didn't hold weight anymore. Not after what Nina had just said. Nina, struggling to stay conscious, lifted her head enough to look at him. "This is all your fault," she spat, her voice shaking with anger. "You said it would just make her sick enough to miss the board meeting next week. You promised it wouldn't be traced." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The board meeting. The one I had been preparing for. The one where I was supposed to present the biggest proposal of my career. It was all starting to come together, in that moment. The tea last month. The breakfast incident 2 months ago. They weren't accidents. They were plans, deliberate attempts to sabotage me. I couldn't hold back anymore. I stepped forward, my voice surprisingly steady as I confronted James. "So, all those times I got sick after eating or drinking at your house, they were all part of this, weren't they? You two were trying to make me sick enough to miss the presentation, to make me seem unreliable." Nina, barely holding on to consciousness, looked at me with a mixture of frustration and fear. She nodded weakly. "The tea, it was supposed to keep you home during the Johnson contract presentation. But you went anyway," she whispered, wincing, with pain. James, still standing by the table, looked like he was losing grip on his composure. "Stop, Nina. You don't know what you're saying," he pleaded. But Nina wasn't having it. "I know exactly what I'm saying," she said, her voice gaining strength despite her distress. "We've been planning this for months, since Christina started outperforming me at every client meeting. We couldn't let her take that client. We needed her out of the way." I felt my blood run cold as she spoke. Everything. The strange texts I'd seen on James's phone, the late-night whispers, the constant weirdness. It was all a part of their plot to take me down. I wasn't imagining it. This wasn't just paranoia. They were trying to destroy my career. They were trying to destroy me. By this point, the sirens were wailing in the distance, getting louder as they approached. And for a brief second, I felt this strange calm wash over me. I had the evidence. I had the proof. The truth was coming out. I pulled back, just enough to let the paramedics do their work as they arrived at the door. I stood to the side, watching as they rushed to Nina, trying to stabilize her. I sent the video of Nina's confession straight to my email, then forwarded it to my lawyer. I needed to make sure I had everything documented. James stood frozen, unable to do anything as his carefully laid plans crumbled in front of him. I didn't look at him. Not now. Instead, I turned to the paramedics. "I'll ride with her to the hospital," I said, my voice steady. "I need to make sure she gets the proper treatment. After all, I need to make sure they're not going to cover this up." With one final glance at James, who looked like he was about to collapse, I followed the paramedics out the door. The truth had come to light, and there was no turning back now. I followed the paramedics as they rushed Nina into the hospital, keeping my phone tucked securely in my hand. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching everything from a distance, unable to fully process what had just happened. But I couldn't let myself fall apart. Not yet. I needed to stay focused. I had to see this through. As we made our way into the emergency room, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder. James was right behind me, but his pace had slowed. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, his hands trembling at his sides. But he didn't approach me. No. He stayed just far enough away, like he knew this was over. I knew the truth, and there was no turning back. I could hear his voice rise in desperation behind me. "Christina, please, you don't understand," he called after me. His voice was tight, but there was something hollow in it, like he was starting to realize his world was crashing down. But I wasn't about to listen to him now, not after everything. I stepped into the waiting room, trying to keep myself together, as the emergency staff worked on Nina. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my lawyer. I quickly replied, letting them know what had happened and that I had everything I needed. Proof. My hands were steady, even though my mind was still trying to catch up with everything. This wasn't just some bad family drama. This was real. This was the beginning of the end for everything they'd planned. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. When they finally did, they wasted no time. They were efficient, calm, as if they had seen it all before. They asked about Nina's condition, then about the events leading up to her collapse. As I explained, I couldn't help but notice James hanging back, standing by the doorway, not moving closer. One of the officers turned to him. "We need you to come with us," they said, their tone firm, but not unkind. James didn't argue. He followed them quietly, his face still pale and drawn. But I saw the panic in his eyes. He knew this was it. The truth had finally caught up with him. I didn't waste any time. I pulled up the video from my phone, the recording of Nina's confession. I played it for the officers, my hands steady, even as my heart felt like it was pounding in my chest. I watched their faces as Nina's voice echoed through the room, telling the truth I had known but couldn't prove until now. "We've been planning this for months, ever since Christina started outperforming me." The officers exchanged looks. One of them, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, turned to me. "Is there anything else you have? Any more evidence?" I didn't hesitate. I pulled out my phone again, scrolling through the messages I'd found on James's phone. The ones where he and Nina discussed sabotaging me, trying to make me sick enough to miss important meetings. I handed it over without a second thought. I needed them to see it all. The deliberate planning. The intent. James shifted uncomfortably, looking anywhere but at me. He kept glancing at the officers, as if hoping they would let him explain. But there was nothing left to explain. The lies had been exposed. The truth was undeniable. As the police began questioning him, my resolve only grew stronger. I had known for months something wasn't right. I had trusted my instincts, and now everything was falling into place. This wasn't just about business or betrayal. This was about survival. I watched as James was led away for questioning, his earlier panic now replaced by a resigned silence. It was over. All of it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally in control. I didn't look back as I walked down the hallway to meet with the detectives. I didn't need to. This was my moment. The truth had been revealed. And no matter what happened next, I knew I had done the right thing. The hours at the hospital passed in a blur. The doctors had managed to stabilize Nina, but I could see the fear in her eyes every time she looked at me. It was the kind of fear that came when someone realized they were no longer in control. Her earlier bravado was gone. She looked small, in that hospital bed, pale and vulnerable, and I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction in seeing the truth finally come out. James, on the other hand, was still trying to play the victim. He kept denying everything, insisting that this was all a misunderstanding. "Christina," he said, his voice trembling slightly as he stood near the nurse's station, trying to get my attention. "You've got to believe me. This isn't what you think. I wasn't having it. Not anymore. Not after everything." He was just trying to weasel his way out of it, pretending like he didn't know what was going on. But I could see through him. I had seen enough to know exactly what they were both capable of. When the toxicology reports came back, the evidence was clear. The doctors confirmed what I had already suspected. The substances in Nina's coffee weren't some strange accident or bad batch of beans. They were deliberate poisons, carefully chosen to cause harm. I watched as the investigators pieced together the plan. Every little detail started to make sense. All those little moments I had brushed off, the sickness after meals, the strange behavior from James and Nina, it was all part of their twisted little game. I stood there, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. The investigators didn't need much from me. They had everything they needed. Nina had confessed. The evidence was there. James was already looking guilty, his face pale and tense, but he still tried to downplay it. "This isn't how it was supposed to go," he muttered, pacing back and forth in the hallway. "You don't understand. We just wanted to slow you down." I couldn't help but laugh, though it was more bitter than anything else. "Slow me down? Is that what this was about?" I asked, my voice steady but carrying that edge of anger I had been holding in check for so long. "You tried to poison me. You tried to ruin my career because you couldn't handle me doing better than you. This wasn't some accident, James. This was planned." He stopped pacing, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. But there was no escaping the truth. Not now. The investigators were already making calls, checking the substances found in Nina's coffee. They were pulling records from the pharmaceutical company James had used to get the poisons. It was only a matter of time before they found everything. James knew it too. His attempts to deflect and deny started to fade into nervous silence. It was like he was finally realizing that no amount of excuses could get him out of this. Then came the breaking point. The investigators had found something in James's office. A stash of clinical notes detailing the poisons they had used, the dosages, and the reactions they were hoping for. They had been documenting everything, like some twisted experiment. I felt a sickening chill as they went through the evidence. "You were documenting everything?" I said quietly, not asking, just stating the fact. My voice had lost any emotion by then. There was nothing left to say. I had known all along, and now it was all coming to light. One of the detectives glanced at me, then back at the evidence. This wasn't just corporate sabotage, was it? This was personal. I nodded slowly. "You're damn right it was." As the officers continued to investigate, the full scope of what James and Nina had done became clearer. They hadn't just been trying to sabotage a career. They had been planning to destroy my life, piece by piece. And they almost succeeded. But not today. Not anymore. As I walked through the hospital hallway, watching them gather the final pieces of evidence, I could feel a strange sense of calm washing over me. It was over. The truth had come out. The plan had unraveled, and I had survived. I had done what I needed to do, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The days leading up to the trial felt like an eternity. The evidence against James and Nina was undeniable. Every text message, every recorded conversation, every document that had been uncovered. I knew the truth, but to see it all laid out in front of me, in that cold, sterile courtroom, was something else. It was like watching the final pieces of a puzzle click into place. I sat there, watching as the prosecution meticulously presented the case, piece by piece. Nina and James were sitting across from me, their faces pale, their eyes darting around nervously, refusing to look me in the eye. There was no bravado left, no smirks, no feigned innocence. They were cornered, and they knew it. When the verdict came, it was swift. James and Nina were found guilty on multiple charges: attempted murder, conspiracy, poisoning. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. The judge spoke calmly, his voice echoing through the quiet room, as he pronounced the maximum sentence. I couldn't feel any satisfaction in that moment. There was no joy, no victory dance, just a deep, overwhelming sense of relief. Justice had been served, but the price had been high. I had lost so much: trust, family, peace of mind. But I had also gained something they could never take from me: the truth. As the courtroom emptied, I watched James and Nina being led away in handcuffs. They didn't speak. There was no fight left in them, no last-ditch attempt to explain themselves. It was over. The silence that followed their departure was deafening, but for me it was filled with something else: closure. The kind of closure I had been fighting for, not just during the trial, but for months, maybe even years. It was the kind of closure that comes when you finally stop being the victim of someone else's twisted game and start owning your own story. I sat there for a moment longer, letting everything sink in. The worst was over. But the relief felt strange, almost surreal. I hadn't come this far just to survive. I had come this far to rebuild, to take control of my life, my career, and my future. And now I could. Walking out of that courtroom, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't the same person who had walked in. I was stronger. I was a survivor. And nothing would ever make me feel powerless again. A year had passed since the trial. It felt like a lifetime ago, but also like it had just happened. I was standing at the podium of the Nashville Business Leaders Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote speech. A crowd of eager faces sat in front of me, all waiting to hear what I had to say. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that still lingered, despite everything I had been through. It wasn't the same kind of nervousness I had felt in the past, though. This time, it was a nervous excitement, a feeling of having earned the place I was in, of having fought for it, not just by surviving, but by thriving. Looking out at the crowd, I reflected on how far I had come. The betrayal, the lies, the months of doubt and fear. It had all been so much. But I wasn't a victim of it anymore. I had taken everything they threw at me and turned it into fuel. Fuel to build something, even stronger than I had before. I spoke from the heart, sharing my journey with them. Success isn't just about talent or hard work, I said, my voice steady and strong. It's about integrity. It's about trusting your instincts, even when the world around you is telling you to doubt yourself. It's about overcoming the challenges that seem impossible and coming out the other side, not broken, but stronger. I could feel the energy in the room shift. People were listening, and I knew that my words were resonating. They had to, because what I had been through wasn't just my story. It was a story of resilience, of turning a dark chapter into a stepping stone toward something greater. As I finished my speech, a flood of people came up to me with kind words, asking for advice, offering congratulations. But as I shook their hands and smiled, there was something deeper inside me, a sense of finality. I had finally moved on from the past. And not just moved on, but stepped into a future that was all mine. Then, as I was wrapping up, I received an email notification on my phone. I glanced down at it and felt a sense of quiet satisfaction wash over me. The Henderson client, after everything, had renewed their contract for another 3 years. I smiled, a small, knowing smile. That was the final confirmation that I was no longer living in their shadow. I had moved forward, and nothing was going to hold me back again. As I sit here reflecting on everything that's happened, I realize that the journey wasn't just about surviving the betrayal. It was about learning to rise above it. The hardest part wasn't the initial shock of what James and Nina did. It wasn't even the trial, or the months of fear and uncertainty. The hardest part was finding a way to let go of the anger, to stop letting their actions control me, and now, looking back, I know the best revenge wasn't about getting even or watching them pay for what they did. No. The best revenge was moving forward. It was taking everything they threw at me and using it to fuel my success. It was about achieving everything they tried to hold me back from. Every step I took toward my goals, every new client, every new opportunity, I made sure it was theirs to watch but never touch. Because in the end, when you let go of the past, when you stop letting someone else's cruelty define you, that's when you truly win. That's when you get the final victory. If you've ever been through something difficult, something that made you question everything, but you came out stronger on the other side, know this: you're not alone. And your story, just like mine, can be a beacon of strength for someone else. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life tales of strength and survival. We all have our battles, but it's how we rise from them that truly defines us.